Okay, hello and welcome to the next webinar in the STEPS webinar series. Tonight we are talking about self-study across subject disciplines. Whether you are joining us from the States or from Australia or Europe or Africa or Asia, we are happy to have you with us. So we would like to take a moment to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, knowing that our time zones are varying quite a bit on this call. So you found us. We are here to have a conversation about self-study, and after a few presentations of some recent work, we will open it up to conversation, because that's what we're all really here for, is conversation and community building. Just a quick reminder that this is being recorded, and we ask that you stay muted during the first portion, during that the presentation part. But then when we stop sharing the screen and open it up for conversation, feel free to jump in, ask questions, share ideas, make connections. Julian, do you want to say something about the webinar series as a whole?
Hello everyone. I'm Julian Kitchen, and I'm the lead editor of the handbook that we're talking about today. Glad to see several of the other editors here already, as well as other authors, both from this section and from other sections. We've had 3 of these so far on the first 3 sections, and 2 more to come on February 18th and March 18th. It's a great way for us to connect as a community and to highlight some of the interesting work that's happening. But please take a look at the handbook as a whole. There's over 1,500 pages of self-study work and reviews of self-studies, over 50 chapters. It's really worth a look, and what we're getting today is a little bit of a sampler package, a really good sampler package, but it gets even better when you dig deeper and read more. So I look forward to the people today presenting. I also thank Laura and Eliza, because making this webinar series possible requires a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes and a lot of skill. So thank you again to both of them for all they've done to bring our community together. So enjoy the session.
Hello all, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As Laura said, I hope that this Thursday or Friday is treating you well. I'm Alicia Crow. I am one of the editors who got to work with Julian to help craft this beautiful piece of scholarship. Tonight, I'm very excited because I had the great pleasure of working with an outstanding group of authors for this section, a section that hopefully encourages us to all think about the ways that disciplinary knowledge and approaches can enhance and expand self-study inquiry, and the ways that self-study inquiry can enhance and expand disciplinary knowledge and ways of being. So today we have authors from 3 of the 7 chapters, and you can see the chapters on the slide. You can see the red highlighting tells you who's going to be here. As Julian said, we've got, this is a sampling of a deeper dive, and they're going to share some key ideas and insights from their analyses. They have read a lot of work, and then also brought from other places to help us all expand our thinking. And I hope their insights really encourage you to wonder, to think about and wonder, how might a disciplinary lens look for my self-study, or how might self-study work extend the disciplinary knowledge of another field that I work in. So we'll have time for questions after all 3 of the presenters. I think Laura mentioned that. That's a really important part. But if you have questions during the presentations, please feel free to drop them in the chat. It'll give us a chance to return to them in the discussion time, and the chat's really useful for documenting in the moment when you don't want to forget. So first up, we have Drs. Edge and Olin here to talk to us about reading literacy and English language arts and the connection to self-study. Thank you all.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you everyone for being here to share our collective work. And Elsie and I are excited to share with you just kind of the overview of our chapter. So first, just Christy Edge from Northern Michigan University, and my co-writer,
Elsie Lindy Olin from University of Central Florida.
We did a systematic review and meta-synthesis of the content areas of reading, literacy, and English language arts teacher education. And if we could just go ahead and advance to the next slide. We'll talk about the context a little bit for a moment and then share kind of the overview of our findings and implications with you. So we chose to think about situating literacy at the heart of just the larger context that we were looking at, because we agree with Moji and others that literacy practices are shaped by discourses, and literacy can be considered a powerful tool that helps us to claim space and identity, and the way that we use literacy and literacy practices has a profound impact on our practice and what is valued. So we really kind of took that at the heart of it all and looked at this content area, this broad content area from a theoretical reading. And there were two just kind of pieces of literature that really informed our thinking early on. And one, within the STEP community, we looked at Vanesh and Kelterman's review up until this point of self-study. And then we looked at, within the discipline, there was a recent review of reading and literacy research, and they had applied a theoretical reading of that research. And it applied a more interpretive lens within that theoretical framework, and it really led to some insights that I felt really spoke to practice. And so we applied the theoretical position of transactional reading theory, which has implications for knowledge, and it comes from Dewey's work, that knowing, the knower, and the known are aspects of one process. And in our field, in our disciplinary field, there were the very conscious position that teaching and learning are one process, not two things kind of hitting, like billiard balls hitting against each other, and that teaching readers and learning to read are aspects of one process. So we took this very broad and important in our discipline theoretical lens that has implications for meaning and how it's made. And we use that as we read the self-study literature from the content area disciplines themselves. So in just this slide itself, you can kind of see our research questions here a bit. We looked just kind of broadly what is learned if we applied this theory as we read the literature. What could we learn about from the studies, but then what could we as self-study researchers also learn as we studied others' meaning making from their practice. So we very consciously and deliberately applied tenets of a core theory within our discipline, and we took the ideas of reader, transaction, and text and meaning making, and we applied those very consciously to self-study. And in our chapter, we go into a lot of detail about that, and we feel like that's a different contribution that we've been making in this chapter. And if we could advance to the next slide just a bit. There were three kind of big themes that we chose to attend to, and within those larger themes, we've outlined some sub-themes, and then of course we go into a lot more detail in the chapter and provide examples. But one of those major themes here on the left, we really saw when we applied this theoretical lens to the literature, the existing literature, just an overarching theme of exploration. And within our discipline of English language arts, reading and literacy, exploration is an important concept. We read to explore and discover new possibilities about ourselves, about others, about the world around us. And that is one of the primary reasons that you would read a piece of literature, is for the purposes of exploration. So it was neat that we saw that theme that was mentioned over and over and over, but not necessarily called attention to for one of the main purposes. But we saw across text and over time that people explored and continued to explore, and that self-study methodology allowed people to kind of step back into this exploration over time, and through collaboration that allowed for multiple points of view. And because of the time, or because of the collaboration, or different, or we're calling text in self-study, it might be their practices themselves, their beliefs about teaching and learning, it might be a particular method, and we go into lots of detail, of course, in the chapter, and there's a chart as well by what we mean by text. And then while navigating and negotiating tensions, that is something that specifically was in the aspect of exploration, something that they explored, which transitions nicely to the second theme that Elsie is going to talk more about.
And so thank you, Christy, that was beautifully articulated. And so within our exploration and our wonderments, what piqued our curiosity was how these researchers that had really discovered in their pedagogical stance and in their theoretical underpinnings these tensions, and they were navigating and negotiating tensions from enacting their wonderings from their teacher education practices in their different disciplines, and how these led to additional learning through meaning making and additional inquiry. Something else that was fascinating was how the self-study researchers made meaning from studying tensions as texts from which they can discover new understandings and wonderings. And so something that Christy and I both sought out was to really look into not only Laughlin's work, Pinniger's work, and Mary Lynn Hamilton's work, when these tensions as texts are rooted in that juxtaposition between teaching about teaching and these conversations where self-study researchers shared and expanded their private thoughts and tensions with other experts from their fields, and how these help them obtain different views and possibilities from their inquiries and learning and teaching. And why is this important? Well, it highlights the importance of exploration in how self-study researchers are positioned to make meaning and generate these understandings of professional learning and practice. It also highlights the role of language and dialogue in transformation. And so it's not only that they're questioning and wondering and revisiting these tensions as they read about the tension, but also in their dialogic interactions, they're also making meaning of the tension. It highlights the role of language and dialogue in transformation. We're also reminded by the literature reviewed and to revisit our positionalities, to take a step back from our work and from our self-study research to see what we already understand through our collaborative discussions. Next, advance to the next slide, please. So something else that Christy and I were immersed was this use of content area knowledge skills and strategies. And so the self-study researchers utilize content area knowledge strategies, skills, and context to frame, to guide, to inform their self-study, to make meaning from their professional practices with the goals of improving their practices and informing their field. Why is this so important? Not only are we making meaning of the content area experiences, we're also sharing these experiences with people that might be removed from experiences similar, even though they share the same content area knowledge. It highlights how self-study researchers explored their practices by actively, intentionally, and critically reading their own and others' professional practices. And it brings the attention to the relationship between teaching, professional learning, transformative learning, revisiting your experiences, and self-study. We can advance the next slide, please. And so moving forward, Christy, is there anything that you would like to add on?
I think it's just really exciting that, you know, sometimes we study the practice itself, the pedagogy, but also what we saw was that they were using disciplinary-based pedagogy as a tool in self-study to study their practice. So it was a form of knowledge, and in the theory that we applied to this reading, the knowledge that you have and the language that you have are what you use to guide your sense making, your meaning making. And we saw them using that very intentionally, explicitly as a tool in self-study to study their own students' learning or their own teaching and how they bettered their practice. So it was just pretty exciting actually to see that.
And something that Christy and I went back and forth was with this idea of tool and also this idea of conduit, right? Being a conduit for making meaning, a conduit for this exploration. And so, yes. And so what do we do when we're moving forward? We would not want this chapter to pretend to be an ending to an inquiry. Contrary to that, Christy and I talked about how it was just a wonderment, new beginnings. And so we went back and forth thinking about how do we end? Well, we don't want to end. We want to further inquire. We want to further disrupt notions. And so we ask, how can we purposely and conscientiously attend to self-study, teacher education, and the content areas in self-study research? How can or do we, as self-study researchers and members of this community that constantly has us thinking about our learning, about our teaching, how do we contribute to the knowledge base and the content areas through self-study research?
I know we're over in time, so I'll just hopefully very quickly say that, in what we saw was that you might take attention, something that's internal, for instance, and you might study that as a text, or even apply disciplinary knowledge from pedagogy and that pedagogical content knowledge in self-study, which is so exciting. And the discussion and the interactions with other F-STEP researchers help us to kind of reposition our thinking about that. And one thing that we really wanted to kind of call more attention for is to take that one extra step and to make some, perhaps, maybe, some thoughts and to share knowledge about the discipline itself. We saw that often we didn't make that one extra loop. And
That connection.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christy and Elsie. I've read this a few times, and just hearing you again, I'm like, oh, I've got so many more ideas again, and thinking. So thank you so much. I'm hoping everybody else is wondering as well. There were some questions that I noted, so we'll come back to those. Dr. Sharkey is here today to talk to us a little bit about English language teaching. So obviously a different field. And hopefully this will just keep you thinking along this same route. So,
okay.
All right, there you are.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, folks. We're all over the globe. It's really exciting to be here. Thank you, Laura, for organizing this session for the STEPSIG, to Julian and all the editors of the handbook. It's such a massive undertaking. And to Alicia, the section editor of Self-Study Across the Disciplines, for this opportunity to contribute to this really considerable, significant project. I'm Judy Sharkey, and I had the pleasure of working with Megan Madigan-Piercy, a well-known and valued member of the STEP community, in co-authoring this chapter on self-study and English language teaching. So we can go to the next slide. Let me see, make sure I can see. Yes. So our review is based on 3 guiding questions. What's the existing research base of English language teaching studies that employ self-study? How do these add to the knowledge base for ELT and ELT teacher education? And what gaps in the ELT education slash research might self-study address and help close? The next slide, please. Thanks. So here are the parameters of our search, the time frame, the search terms, etc., and what we ended up including for our analysis. We looked within journals from education and applied linguistics, the 2 main disciplines that inform ELT. In addition to the 14 studies that explicitly name self-study as their methodology or research genre, we included 16 that did not use that term, but had self-study, what we called self-study leanings or epistemological, ontological affinity. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, here's some groovy artwork, right? I'm not sure if people can see it very well. So not surprising, we found a lack of attention on ELT teacher educators' overall development and on their pedagogies. But this was a bit surprising to us because of the what's known as the sociocultural turn that began in applied linguistics in the early 2000s. So it's important to note that there have been calls for greater focus on the pedagogies of ELT teacher educators and greater self-reflexivity of ELT scholars in the last 4 to 5 years. And there has been some exciting movement here just not in time for our review. So we think something that's actually kind of exciting is that there has been this kind of like burst in just the last couple of years, people doing some great work in critical autoethnography and language teacher identities. Very exciting. So so that's a good thing. It's a good thing. Also, not surprising given the silos of academia, we found a lack of interaction between applied linguistics and education research. So researchers, scholars within applied linguistics who situate their work within English language teacher education do not necessarily draw on the research in general teacher education. And we do see that it goes the other way as well. Sometimes folks in the education research, even though we have these shifting demographic patterns where more and more classrooms and public schools are welcoming multilingual populations, the educators don't always go to applied linguistics to understand some of the research and contributions that are there. So this lack of interaction was really fascinating for us, and it led us on a bit of professional genealogy. So our seeking to understand our own professional DNA, we're like, what, we don't find a lot of people who do the kind of work that Megan and I do. Again, it's great that this is changing, but the people who really work at this nexus of working with multilingual populations, so drawing on applied linguistics and also working in general education. So we came up with this metaphor of the double helix. So you can see how clever this is. Not really, but so this is what we talk about: the two strands. Applied linguistics is the one strand, and education is the other strand. And it takes those very special base pairs, folks like Megan and others, and maybe me sometimes, to bring these two strands together. So that is why we talk about this step leaning in the ELT scholarship. So even though there has been this movement recently for greater self-reflexivity and calls for greater attention on the pedagogy and the development of English language teacher educators, because there's not connection with education overall, people don't really know that STEP exists. And so some of the studies that we called were STEP leaning, they lack the robust methodology and tools of inquiry from design and interpretation that STEP does. Okay, I think we're on to the next slide. Thanks. So in our review, we identified two main themes in the inquiries. Sorry. Social and professional identities and the locus of inquiry. And again, this is not surprising given self-study, right? So within professional identities, this included attending to the tensions and insights gained from the shifts that occur as one moves from one professional status or set of being to another. Examples include moving from an English language learner to an English language teacher, becoming a language teacher educator, and when the English language teacher educator attends to her own second language learning process. So for example, one person is an English teacher in Japan, but started learning Japanese and then did a diary study on the process of her language learning and how that started to affect the way she was teaching theories of second language acquisition in her own classes. And finally, another example was when a teacher educator went back to the language teaching classroom to see how that experience would inform her work as a teacher educator. In the social identities, the 9 studies that we identified here explored a variety of aspects within this realm, with authors explicitly naming and exploring how the intersecting factors of bi or multilingualism, transnationalism, gender, race, and or motherhood were integral to their professional identities and the inquiries they pursued. Another theme was the locus of inquiry. And because of the critical impact of the sociocultural context in which ELT professionals practice, both in shaping practice and the ways in which the knowledge of context mediates English language teaching, the locus of work emerges as an important theme for ELT self-study. And by locus of work, we mean the context that served as the focal point of inquiry. For example, teacher education coursework, practicum experiences, coaching, mentoring, interactions, and collaborative interactions of language teacher educators. So, and those could be informal networks, being involved in a community of practice, to working with critical friends. Okay, I think the next slide. Yes, so a major finding was this, who was named and not named, and okay, sorry. A major finding was who named and explored the impact of their social identities on their work and their development as teacher, educator, scholars. So whiteness and English language as one's first language are noticeably not named. So really only in one of the 10 studies do people take up issues of whiteness and being an English dominant speaker. This quote on the left, I don't know if you can see it, is from Carmen Mercado, who had one of the very first self-studies that we identified in the literature from 1996. And she says, "I know that my experience as a Puerto Rican are a major influence on my pedagogy." And this statement is right in the beginning of her study. It's such a powerful example of how the majority of scholars who did address the intersection of social identities with their work took this up in ways that really challenged these deficit perspectives of the field. And when we think about this field in itself, you know, it has a history of dominance, of hierarchy. And so for this group of scholars to so forcefully name the ways that their identities contribute to our understanding of what our students and what our society needs, it was very, very powerful, really stood out to us. So one of our claims here is that English monolingualism warrants greater examination for its detrimental effects on learners. Okay, and I think I have my next slide is the last one. And this is just the way we think ELT and STEP are better when they're together, just like that coffee and that sweet. They bring out the best in each other. STEP helps the ELT scholarship by bringing this robust methodology and strong community of scholars and scholarship. And we think ELT in its, the scholarship and the research on social identities can bring a lot to the STEP world, but also it really increases our global participation in STEP. We found studies from Iran, Korea, Vietnam, Venezuela, many countries. So I think that's all I have time for. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you, Judy. That was awesome. I really appreciate it. And we have one more from Robin. Dr. Brandenburg is coming to us from Australia this morning/evening. And she's going to focus again one more turn into mathematics this time.
Good morning here. Good evening. Hello to everybody. It's actually a real privilege to be here today and to share our chapter. Before I begin, I also would like to acknowledge the work of Eliza and Laura in getting this together. They've got brilliant skills in the technology and it's just flowing beautifully. To Julian and to all the other chapter and I guess the section editors, and especially to you, Alicia. We've had a lot of interactions over the preparation of this chapter, and I want to thank you for that, especially the time difference too. Of course, to the Springer team. And especially to Sandy Shuck, Professor Sandy Shuck, my co-author. She is now retired, and she is the most highly regarded scholar, not only in her field, but especially in self-study. And I know we formed a much deeper relationship, writing research, colleague relationship, in working on this chapter over a long period of time. So I wanted to acknowledge that. Before I begin, if we can just go to the next slide, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, so next slide. The focus of this chapter was to provide an analysis of what self-study has contributed to maths education, and also to pose questions about future directions of the ways that self-study might progress. Now, to do that, we had a look at everything from 1995 to 2016. And we found 33 outputs. Most of these were in the Studying Teacher Education Journal, and also from the conference proceedings, and basically the chapters in one key text. So we had 17 journal articles, an edited book, 12 book chapters, 3 conference papers, and of the 17 journal articles, 12 were published in Studying Teacher Ed. I just want to hold this up. This is one of the key books, 2011, and it was edited by Sandy and Peter, and it has the 12 chapters. So I'd actually direct you to that as well as to the handbook. So next. All right, so the key themes from looking through the literature, we found that the location was basically right across the board in terms of primary, secondary, in teacher education and in tertiary maths. But one of the silences was early childhood. There's very little in the early childhood field. And later in this chat, I'll talk about some of the gaps and silences, because while there were some things that were very prominent, and I see some connections with the previous 2 presentations, there were certainly some areas that were almost silent or not as developed. So I'll talk about that later. One of the key things was the range of pedagogical approaches, and things like role-playing, things like use of metaphor, critical incidents, differentiated learning. So, you know, we speak about roundtable reflective inquiry. That's something that I'm quite familiar with. And I guess one of the major contributions that we found in developing this chapter was that it challenges that whole idea that maths is non-creative, that it's just a procedural thing that you have to do and memorize, and that it's a whole set of, you know, distinct yet unrelated skills and techniques. So what we found in this was this creative aspect. For example, in the role-playing, one of the teachers, teacher educators, asked the students to be grade 5 pupils. So they needed to be acting as grade 5s, and they had what they call a pause button. So they had to act in terms of whatever the content was, but then they could press the pause button and do the explicit thinking out loud. So there were things like that, and I think that that's very important in terms of a self-study and a contribution. There was also a focus on feedback and ways to to give and to get feedback. And these were things like reflective journaling. We've probably heard a lot of these right across the disciplines. Student work samples, online feedback surveys, tickets out of class or exit tickets. So of the 33, 19 of the self-studies focused on specific approaches. There was definitely a focus on collaboration and or individual learning. So as others have mentioned today, critical friends are really important, as well as the role of using critical incidents to explore mathematical concepts and approaches. And one that I thought was quite interesting was McGlynn Stewart in 2010. Now, as a teacher educator, gave a test. She gave the test back. We're very familiar with tests in maths. The class, the students walked out. They were depressed. They were desperate and defeated, were her words. She questioned her confidence as a teacher. She went to her critical friend who just happened to be not in maths. And that's another thing that people talk about, having a critical friend that is not in your field. So there's a different insight into that. So they discussed it and they realized that they had completely different assumptions about what this test was about. The students thought it was about the content knowledge for a kindergarten to 3 maths content area, and she believed it was about theory and pedagogy. So then we moved down to a lot of the work in this chapter was about challenging assumptions. So we need to know what they are. So moving on to that, challenging beliefs. We all turn up into any discipline with a particular set of assumptions. And I love this term here of the authors speaking of resisting complacency. So that's what we have to do, and there's certainly ways of doing that. And often it's through questioning, and certain questions like, why didn't I learn maths like this in primary school? If I could go back, why might you think that? How do you know? And can you prove that? Which is something really important in the maths field. The teacher-educator journey. So how the teacher-educators learnt through this process of researching their practice was once again critical. So do the next slide. Thank you. So the implications and insights. I go back to John Loughran. How can I use this study's findings to improve my practice? Now that was in 2006, and that really hasn't changed. So it's about an enactment, what changes in practice. So I want to go now to not only the strengths of what we found, but some things where we thought there were some gaps and perhaps silences. Being aware that this was 2016, we're now 2021. I know there's a whole body of knowledge now and things have changed. References to pedagogical content knowledge, to mathematical content knowledge, and I would add to mathematical knowledge for teaching. I think we could focus a little bit more on that as self-study researchers, because that seemed to be missing. And if you look, not completely missing, but perhaps minimalized, maybe marginalized, where people focused more on the journey and the learning and whatever. So that was one that we were a little bit surprised about. References, as I've already mentioned, to the early childhood maths education. Technologies in maths education. Specifically assessment in maths education, gender, race and class in maths learning and teaching, and the role of ethics in maths learning and teaching. That's one of my little pet areas as well. So maybe I was a little bit subjective there. Final slide. Our conclusions that we reached, and it's a 15,000 word chapter, to contract it to a 10-minute presentation. is a bit tricky, but these are our recommendations, that perhaps we need to expand the nature of the methodologies that we use in maths research, that we do need to be aware of the gaps and silences, and it's not only until we're aware of those that we can address them. So I think that's important. We definitely need to drill deeper into the mathematical content, so that the pedagogical content knowledge, the mathematical content knowledge, and the mathematical knowledge for teaching is highlighted, because as we know, a number of people really struggle with their confidence in math. So it's that whole balance between confidence and competence. And to invite colleagues from broader mathematical disciplines to join self-study. So I think that's another part perhaps of our advocacy that we need to be aware of. And I did have a little think this morning too, just one more, was that cross-disciplinary nature of mathematics. And final words, there's a whole section there on being reform-based. And to be reform-based, we need to be time generous. And I love that term, time generous, as often we present maths at an incomprehensibly fast rate. So we need time for it to just settle. And I think self-study is the way to reform mathematics teaching and learning. So thank you.
Thank you, Robin. That was great. I really appreciate it, all the hard work. And we have a lot of really good questions. I know some folks may have some other questions popping up. I'll go back to one of the first ones. And Jack, you had posed a question early on. I know there was one that Christy answered, but I'm not sure that the very first one you did. No, I'm trying to find the right one. There's one for Elsie about the research into the meanings of S-STEP researchers, if you have any evidence of these meanings. So Jack, if you want to go back and pull one of those or two out,
Yeah,
one of
sure.
those out.
It's something actually that Marie Huxtable's also focused on in one of the last questions about what is educational. You know, as all members of the American Educational Research Association, I was just fascinated that I hadn't heard educational actually mentioned in any of the S-STEP presentations. So I was just asking, and it was one to Christy and Elsie, but that fits with everybody else's presentation, I think. If you have any evidence, and this was to Elsa, in the meanings, that the S-STEP researchers could explain their educational influences in the learning of their students. So that's what I was trying to focus on in S-STEP research, and I have for many years. You know, what is educational in the learning that we're actually influencing?
And I know everyone actually read a lot of different pieces that are from the self-study community. So if anyone wants to, there's probably an answer we can come to in 15 minutes or less. But any insights that you all have for any of these pieces for Jack and Marie?
Well, from our chapter, if you don't mind me jumping in with you, Elsie, please interrupt as you see fit. But, you know, our theoretical frame, you know, was derived from Dewey's work, which is educative experience is that which helps us to continue to learn. But the self-study researchers who studied their practice, they did so with the intent to help their students to learn, you know, so that's what they reported on. So their meaning making was in essence to help them better understand. So if they wanted to study a particular disciplinary approach, you know, if I do small groups here, does this help my readers to be able to better understand and learn? And so that's what they actually studied, but they made meaning about that. So we were looking at their meaning making, but they were looking at their students, you know, in order to understand and make meaning. So yes, there is evidence in their self-studies that we were looking at their meaning making of, if that helps, if I'm understanding your question.
Yeah, sorry, it was just in the meaning making, whether as part of that meaning, they focused on what their educational influence is in the learning of their students. I mean, we can all give meaning, do you follow? We can all have a rhetoric about improving learning, but when we ask for evidence in S-STEP research, what is the evidence of the learning?
So
sorry, okay.
So for one, it depends on the context, right? So for instance, one study, a particular, and I'd have to look to see who it was and what year, but she was looking at the influence of the testing curriculum, the testing culture in her curriculum, and she wanted to bring back joy. So she studied her students, it's hard to quantify, right, joy, but how she changed her practice and how her students responded to that, and how they, if learning and can be conceived of as joy toward reading, and I would say that it can, you know, that's what she studied as a result of her self-study, is the impact it had on her students.
Jack, so something else that I think was privy to the meaning was the metacognitive stance. Many of the researchers asked, why am I engaging in this pedagogical practice? And made meaning of that. So initially it was, why am I doing what I'm doing? And how is this influencing students' learning? Is there space to further research the meaning making specifically beyond the metacognitive stance, but also how you learned is fascinating to me.
Yes, okay.
Because many times you teach as you were taught.
Yeah.
And so I think it's fascinating.
Okay.
Can I add something in as well, just on the side? I think it's a really good question, Jack, because you do say, how do I improve my educational practice? Well, you know, say for me personally, it's challenging assumptions. I do that through roundtable reflective inquiry with students. They learn how to do that. Your next part of that, though, is about evidence. So how do we know that we're having what I say is an impact? And I think that's the key question, is how do we measure the impact of what we do with our students? And then how does that get measured when they go out into schools, for example? So I know for us there is a focus here currently on impact measurement. So now they're going to track what we do in teacher education programs to the impact in the classroom. So it is about evidence, and I think it is about collecting evidence. I do collect evidence. They write up their assumptions early in the semester. They revisit them, whether they've been challenged or supported or whatever at the end of that particular amount of time. But realistically, I have them for a semester. So, you know, and you're part of that patchwork. So I think it's a really big question, and it's a good one for us to focus on, the evidence and the impact.
Agreed. And we could, of course, I'm just making note, we only have about 5 minutes left in terms of asking questions before we'll have to start wrapping up. But I wanted to bring up one, Laura had asked a question earlier about the assumptions, and I think actually all three chapters have bits about assumptions. I know Robin just brought it up very specifically in hers, but did any of the ones in the chapters, the pieces that you read, explore assumptions about like social justice, student-centeredness? You know, what was some of the things that you saw? And then Laura, you could reframe if I didn't quite capture it right.
No, I think you captured it exactly right. It's that kind of the reflecting on just a moment ago, we teach as we've been taught unless we reflect on our assumptions differently. And so what levels of evidence did we see of those kinds of things? So yes.
Would anyone like to share some from there? Go ahead.
Yeah, if I could jump in. So in this category of the social identities that we talked about, that's really informed by Ryan Morgan's work in identity as pedagogy, right? And the ways that you can't really separate who you are. So not even what you've been taught, but right, who you are is what you bring to the classroom. So in one really, and I think this also connects back to what do we mean by education or learning, or where do we see something happening? As someone influenced by that sociocultural stuff, I really am drawn to that definition of learning as a transformation in participation. So when I can see students start to do something differently, if we're having a class and discussions about advocating for particular groups of students or parents, they start doing that, right? Then I can see they're adopting different professional identities. And for me, that is a really powerful piece of the learning. But one example that kind of gets back to this, social justice, critical social justice issue. One of our chapters was written by three female scholars who were all immigrant mothers, all Korean Americans, and they were teaching in early childhood classes, and their authority as multilingual women raising multilingual children was challenged by their white monolingual students. And there was a way they were keeping their identities outside of this university classroom space, but through finally like bringing it into the space, their students actually learned how to talk to immigrant mothers and families and engage in a way that would not have been possible if these three authors had not brought their social identities to bear into this work of preparing teachers for these communities. So I think as a collection, that was really powerful to see the way that people could use their experiences in the world as a way to change the world.
Does someone have a question that we haven't gotten to, that we haven't thought about? I want to make sure that I hadn't seen a hand, but Marie had, I'm trying to bring it, I'll go back then. Marie had a question about the meaning of educator across these chapters and the section, whether you're differentiating the practice from that of instructor, mentor, coach. What assumption are you making as to the nature of the teaching and learning that is educational? That goes on to the second part, I think, that we started. But first one would be what is the meaning you are giving to educator in self-study across subject disciplines, and whether you're differentiating the practice from that of instructor, mentor, coach. I think many of us, I've read all these, and I think everyone has similar about the variety, but if somebody wants to address from their chapter's perspective, I know from my chapter, I did not put a definition that I put on top of what educator was, but would anyone like to?
Well, in our chapter, we reported like the types of, people who were calling themselves educators, but we didn't analyze that component necessarily, but we did look at that, and we called them readers. Who were the readers of their practices? What context are they in? And what were the texts that they were like trying to make meaning from? And so we did report, and we did see, that in our discipline, it was, teacher educators. We didn't put a number on that though. K-12, and then there were some professional learning coaches or instructors, but they were all within some sort of traditional educational setting in our literature that we reviewed.
Well, I've gotten the nod that it's time for us to start wrapping up. I hate for it to come to an end, but I'm going to hand it over back to Eliza. Thank you all, and thank you, Eliza and Laura. Before you go, again, this has been amazing. You all have done so much work, and now it just flows. We don't have to do anything; it just happens. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, we're just so glad that you all are coming and celebrating in this work, and it's so great to see all of you. We hope that you'll all join us for our next webinar, which is, as you can see on the screen, February 18th. So put it in your calendars now. Yeah, we're really excited about it, and I think it'll be a great addition to our webinars, which are all on the website. So follow us on Twitter and Facebook, all of this. Okay, the conversation does not have to end because all of our presenters are awesome and there's lots more to discuss, but this is the official end so that people who have to leave can leave, but not before celebrating by giving away a book in the most awesome self-study tradition. So, are we ready for the drum roll? Our awesome person who wins is, and I'm going to butcher your name, I'm so sorry, Tomas Elward. I'm sure I did that so badly.
Aylward,
but-
most impressive. Thank you.
So congratulations to you. We're so glad that you could join us, and you will be getting an email from the wonderful Julian Kitchen with details on your new self-study book that you get to have. So, yeah.
Many thanks.
Yeah. All right. So let the conversation continue. And for those who have to leave us, we're so glad that you were able to join in this conversation. We hope to see you next time.